Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 10th week of 2013. A week in which a Tea Party senator filibustered President Obama's torture-supporting CIA nominee over civil liberties, while the Democratic Party establishment, notably our own Senator Durbin, mocked him and fumed. The filibusterer, I mean. 4 years ago, John Brennan's advocacy of torture forced him to withdraw from the top CIA spot to which Obama wanted to nominate him. But now, all Senate Democrats, except two, voted to confirm him, in spite of what the filibuster revealed to the American people. CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou went to jail for exposing one torturer. 1 week later, enhanced interrogation pioneer and assassination czar Brennan is confirmed as head of the U.S. Secret Police. Yesterday, Obama's Attorney General explicitly made the extraordinary claim that the authorization for the use of military force, passed by Congress right after 9/11, authorizes military force on U.S. soil, exercised at the President's discretion. He claimed that the President can kill Americans, the Attorney General claimed that the President can kill Americans on U.S. soil with a drone, if he chooses, and Congress can't stop him. Bush torture apologist John Yoo, now holding down an academic sinecure on the West Coast, defended Obama and Brennan and attacked Rand Paul. When John Yoo is on your side, you're on the wrong side. But he wasn't alone. House Democrat leader Nancy Pelosi was asked if the government has the legal authority to disappear American citizens, render them to another country, put them in jail without notice, hold them indefinitely, kill them. Minority Leader Pelosi was asked if the government has the legal authority to do that. She thought for a minute. Maybe, she said. For more than 20 years, our program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Szoke. We'll take turns suggesting an item from the week's news that's been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, and then asking our colleagues to comment on it. At the end, we'll have time for Coburn's Corner, where we'll nominate cliches, overused phrases, and tedious words for elimination. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. So we're cablecasting from Neptune on the 8th day of March, 2013. It's International Women's Day, originally called International Working Women's Day, when it was established in 1909 in the United States following the declaration by the Socialist Party of America. In August 1910, an International Women's Conference was organized to precede the general meeting of the Socialist Second International in Copenhagen. Inspired in part by the American socialists, German socialists proposed the establishment of an annual International Women's Day. Delegates, 100 women from 17 countries, agreed with the idea as a strategy to promote equal rights, including suffrage, for women. The following year, in 1911, International Women's Day was marked for the first time by over 1 million people in Austria, Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire alone, there were 300 demonstrations. In Vienna, women paraded and carried banners honoring the Paris Commune, the most important political event, perhaps, of the late 19th century, unknown, of course, to most people today. There were protests against sex discrimination in employment and the demand for the right to vote and hold political office. But the demonstrations were specifically in honor of the Commune. In 1917, demonstrations marking International Women's Day in St. Petersburg on the last Sunday in February, but that's according to the Julian calendar. It fell on the 8th of March, according to the Gregorian calendar, today's date. Demonstrations in St. Petersburg for International Women's Day initiated the Russian Revolution, and it became an official holiday in the Soviet Union. In the West, International Women's Day was first observed as a popular event after 1977, when the United Nations General Assembly invited member states to proclaim March 8 as the UN Day for Women's Rights and World Peace. The decline from International Working Women's Day to International Women's Day is a striking example of the substitution of identity politics for class politics. Since the 1970s, American liberalism has all but given up its opposition to economic inequality, trumpeted as its position since the New Deal, and to cover this cowardly retreat, American liberals have embraced fervent opposition to discrimination by race, gender, etc. It's no accident that the same period has seen a vast and accelerating growth in economic inequality in the U.S. We're a much more unequal society today than we were 40 years ago, even if we're more civilized on matters of race and gender. But economic inequality was the conscious goal of the 1%, to roll back the social supports achieved in the generations before and after World War II, from Social Security to Medicare. Known as neoliberalism, this quiet but quite effective campaign enlisted figures from both U.S. political parties, up to and including Barack Obama, whom Glenn Ford calls not the lesser evil, but the more effective evil. As a result, real wages for most Americans have been flat or declining since the early 1970s, and the U.S. now has the most unequal distribution of wealth of any industrialized country. And even after a second and perhaps even a third wave of feminism, International Working Women's Day, if it's noticed at all, has become Women's Day. It's a fashion magazine, I think. Ron Szoke, who is on his way to the big demonstration commemorating the Paris Commune, has a moment to talk about the events of this day.
Yes, well, I will turn aside from that for a few minutes and comment on the passing of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. The American media have predictably befouled themselves with put-downs of Mr. Chavez and what he has done with or to the country of Venezuela. Here's a relatively neutral piece from the Associated Press. President Chavez dead. The government announced the death of President Hugo Chavez on Tuesday, ending 14 years of charismatic rule by the firebrand socialist, but leaving his party firmly in control of the nation. Further down, we read that the vice president, who probably will become the next elected president, Maduro, made a virulent speech against enemies he claimed were trying to undermine Venezuelan democracy. So not only was there a speech, it was a virulent speech. Further on, we get allusions to the 2002 attempted coup, which lasted about 3 days. This says that Chavez's inner circle has long claimed the United States was behind a failed 2002 attempt to overthrow him, and he has frequently played the anti-American card to stir up support in Venezuela. Venezuela has been without a U.S. ambassador since July 2010. Why would he be able to do that, stir up the people with anti-American rhetoric? We're not told. We're not told that whether it's true that the United States was behind a failed 2002 attempt to overthrow him. So they're not taking a stand on the contribution of American subversion to that attempted coup. The foreign minister said that a second U.S. Air Force attaché was being expelled, also for alleged espionage. Quote, let's remember that active participation of the United States in the fascist coup of 2002, he said. But we're hearing very little about that. In fact, almost nothing. Why is that? Point two, very interesting and rather touching piece by Lula da Silva, the former president of Brazil for 8 years. History, he says, will affirm justifiably the role Hugo Chavez played in the integration of Latin America and the significance of his 14-year presidency to the poor people of Venezuela, where he died on Tuesday after a long struggle with cancer. One need not agree with everything Mr. Chavez said or did. There's no denying that he was a controversial, often polarizing figure, one who never fled from debate and for whom no topic was taboo. I must admit, Lula says, that I often felt that it would have been more prudent for Mr. Chavez not to have said all that he did, but this was a personal characteristic of his that could not, even from afar, discredit his qualities. And here's the crucial part, I think. Mr. Chavez was instrumental in the 2008 treaty that established the Union of South American Nations, a 12-member intergovernmental organization that might someday move the continent toward the model of the European Union. In 2010, the community of Latin American and Caribbean states leapt from theory to practice, providing a political forum alongside the Organization of American States. It does not include the United States and Canada, as the OAS does. The Bank of the South, a new lending institution independent of the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, also would not have been possible without Mr. Chavez's leadership. Finally, he was vitally interested in fostering closer American ties, Latin American ties with Africa and the Arab world. So this made him anathema to a lot of people in this country, apparently, trying to make Latin America independent of American dominance and control. So Lula says the multilateral institutions Mr. Chavez helped create will also help ensure the consecration of South American unity. He will no longer be present at South American summit meetings, but his ideals and the Venezuelan government will continue to be represented. The democratic camaraderie among the leaders of Latin America and the Caribbean is the best guarantee of political, economic, social, and cultural unity that our peoples want and need. So that may be dubious, but I think he has a point. So, yeah, the interview on the radio this morning about the masses, apparently approaching millions, demonstrating in Caracas and paying their respects to Mr. Chavez. Had a couple of interviews, one with a poor man who was an enthusiastic supporter, another one with a rich woman who claimed that he was a disaster for Venezuela for 14 years. And the class division there became rather stark, as it usually does, between the few rich and the many poor. Theme 2. I wondered last week on whether the Swiss would pass the referendum that would try to curb executive pay. They did. This headline says the Swiss overwhelmingly vote to curb executive pay. And I'm wondering, why have we heard so little about this? The Fat Cat Initiative, as it was called, reins in corporate pay. So this resolution, with the backing of nearly 68% of the voters, Agent France Press reports that the so-called Fat Cat Initiative would limit the mandate of board members to 1 year and would ban certain kinds of compensation, including the so-called golden handshakes or golden parachutes given to executives when they leave a company, amounting sometimes to tens of millions of dollars, the justification being so they won't go to work for some other company. The BBC adds that this measure would give shareholders a veto on compensation and ban big payoffs for new and departing managers. American corporations are well insulated against this legally. The shareholder votes, when there's a shareholder revolt, can usually be put down, and they are not determinative anyway. What has happened in Europe, Western Europe, that have provoked this, and in the USA, another piece from the New York Times on March 1st, a high dollar debutante ball. This is about the Geneva Auto Show and the number of luxury automobiles on display there, many of them carrying a price tag of over $1 million. This says, while mass market automakers like Fiat, Ford, General Motors, and Volkswagen are struggling in Europe with bloated inventories, falling sales, and red ink, many luxury brands are reporting record sales and profits. Hence, an unprecedented number of ultra-expensive new cars will be mixed among the 130 or so premieres at Geneva. Among them is the new Bentley Flying Spur. To differentiate itself further from the Continental GT Coupe and move further upscale in presence and price, the Flying Spur sedan gets its own platform and styling treatment. Engineering advances will pump output from its W12 engine up to 616 horsepower. Wow, we really needed that. A W12 engine is a curiosity, I think. 4 banks of 3 cylinders each, and it's a marvel of technology, but you have to wonder why anyone would ever need one. Finally, the remaining main point. Today in the local daily, great recessions hit, finally erased, mainly by the wealthiest. The regained wealth with the rising stock market of the past few months. Most of it from higher stock prices has been flowing mainly to richer Americans. By contrast, middle-class wealth is mostly in the form of home equity, which has risen much less. So it's the usual story of the rich getting richer far faster than the economic pie is really growing. This says the Dow Jones Industrial Average has just set a record high since bottoming in March 2009. The Dow has jumped 119%. Roughly 80% of the stocks are held by the richest 10% of the households. So that's where the rising riches are going for the most part. So what do you think of this situation, gentlemen?
I think if you want to sell a luxury car, the place you should take it is China.
Yeah,
apparently, those cars are going much better in China than they are in Europe and the United States, in spite of the wealthy are doing very well.
Yeah.
So,
do you lust after $1 million car, David?
Well, I lust, but not after that. I guess just a couple of comments on the Venezuela, although I guess I'll have more to say about that. It's amazing how many experts there are on this 28 million person country. All of a sudden, everybody knows everything that's what's good for them and what's happened to them. Everybody knows about their economy and their corruption and their violence and all of the problems that we are so concerned about. Two, you mentioned some of the code words about polarizing figure and populist firebrand and all this lurid language that has been used for years in the context of Chavez. The word authoritarian, takes on its own technical meaning in terms of a man elected to office who yes, limited some legislative powers and used his authority as a result of being elected to order stuff to happen, which of course doesn't happen in any other country. Leaders in any other country aren't authoritarian because they don't behave in this way. And when corporate leaders in this country go to Congress to sit in back rooms and write legislation on various issues, which of course inevitably get passed by the legislators who are benefited with their contributions, that is not authoritarianism. But when Chavez is elected by the people of Venezuela to do things like make the poor less poor, and he does that, that's authoritarianism. The other word that pops up in a kind of more strange and disingenuous way is the word sustainable. We're all worried now, all these people who are busy raping the earth for all they can get, they're worried that the Venezuelan economy, based on oil exports, will not be sustainable, that this just isn't a model that can last. And of course, we all know that our own country, as we've gone through the various eras of agricultural, industrial, carbon, high tech, we all know that the first thing that we've been concerned about as we've gone into each of these eras is whether it was going to be sustainable. We have had no other concern as to whether this was the wise thing to do, both for the long, not to mention for the environment, but for the viability of the standard of living of those people. So now we found that the automobile economy that was based in Detroit in the 1950s and 60s somehow turned out not to be sustainable. Was anybody worried about it at that time? Has anybody been worried about it since in a kind of fundamental sense? No. But Venezuela has, I guess they're privileged. I guess they must be thought of as incredibly wonderful people and people that can be held to such a high standard.
Irony in one so young, David.
It's really hard for me not to be, and I know that sarcasm and all this is not, people always tell me that sarcasm is the lowest form of humor, and, I don't know what to say. So this is the lowest form of politics.
Yeah, exactly, it attracts it. Exactly right. You a comment on that, Ron?
No.
Okay. I thought one of the things that came up here, I think you're quite right to excoriate the new lows reached by the American press in describing Chavez and misrepresenting Chavez, as you both point out. But I thought there was a particularly sharp example from the Associated Press. The Associated Press is this faceless organization, this group of, it's a news service, a wire service. Most of the international news you read in the pages of the News Gazette, for example, are from the Associated Press, which is a consortium of groups, but they use their own reporters and so forth. And in recent years, they've been doing a good deal more of issue reporting, giving you accounts of what the real story is on the deficit, say, or what's really going on in Afghanistan, for example. Remarkably ideological, but done in this sort of bland, faceless fashion that we say, oh, well, it's got to be the truth because we have a free press, and here's what the press is reporting. They had a great example. There's a great example of their work from the Chavez thing. An article from their correspondent on Venezuela pointed out that Chavez, of course, had squandered the oil monies, wasted them on education, health care, and so forth, instead of contributing, as, say, the Emir of Dubai did, to building the world's tallest building. And that there is a result, no sort of physical, or not much of physical example of the building programs of Chavez, because it all went into education and health care. Now, this is astonishing. This sounds like it's something out of The Onion, something out of one of the parody sites, but that was the Associated Press take on it. Loved it.
Yeah, apparently, this was referred to on Amy Goodman this morning when she was asking the question to a woman in Venezuela who very much represents, I think, the Venezuelan women's movement. I'm sorry, I can't think of her name right now, but did a long interview in which Amy Goodman threw a few of these quotes at her. And that quote also about what was going on in Dubai and so forth included the fact that they apparently have they have gotten a couple of art, museums, the Louvre, and the Metropolitan or Carnegie.
The Guggenheim was one. Yeah,
that's it. To invest money in establishing a kind of annex of art and
in the Persian Gulf.
In the Persian Gulf. So just the idea that they would suggest that that Chavez somehow let his people down by not establishing an annex to the Guggenheim in Caracas, as opposed to feeding people.
This would be just ludicrous, except it was an example of the AP and the sort of news that people get, why Americans don't know what's going on in Venezuela or in Latin America in general. And as Chomsky himself points out, what we've actually been seeing is the first sort of independent renewal in Latin America since the conquest, since 1492, and that these last years, the years indeed that Chavez has been president of Venezuela, have been a crucial transformation that's driving the United States government, in this administration and the last one, nuts, because in fact the Latin Americans are not taking up the role that the United States assigns to them of being good clients, and that's why the U.S. was so opposed to Chavez and continues to be.
Yeah, I was annoyed by the way the AP ducked the 2002 coup.
Yes.
This says. Chavez's inner circle has long claimed the United States was behind a failed 2002 attempt to overthrow him, without telling us whether it's true that the U.S. was behind that.
And in fact, there's no one who knows anything about it, the rest of the world, who doubts that the U.S. was behind that coup. So, if someone brought up in discussing coups, I think it may have been on Amy's show too, someone mentioned the old question about, coups in Latin America and so forth, but they say there's never been a coup in Washington, D.C. Why is that? And the answer being there's no American embassy there. So who's behind the coup? Yes. Right.
Well, there's the much disputed one that of the late 30s when they were going to overthrow Roosevelt. But again, that discussion is mired down in a lot of ambiguity.
You're watching News from Neptune. David Green, I think, has a deal for us.
Yeah, I'm sort of going to continue on the same path and just make a few comments and maybe just to broaden the perspective a little bit. Latin America has always been under the thumb of the United States. A good background book for this is something called by a Uruguayan writer, Eduardo Galeano, called The Open Veins of Latin America. And of course, Chomsky has been writing about this for years. I happen to be reading one of his interview books with David Barsamian called What We Say Goes from about 2006, which covers a lot of this ground. But it's just one of the few times, I guess I've been pleasantly surprised and sort of shockingly surprised politically 2 times in my life. One was on March 31st. Well, I mean, in a positive sense. I guess I have to qualify it by saying in a positive sense. On March 31st, 1968, Lyndon Johnson resigned from office. And sometime in April of 2002, I turned the radio on a Sunday afternoon after having heard about the coup in Venezuela, perhaps on Friday, and assuming that this was just another one down the tubes and nothing could be done about it. And I turned the radio on the following Sunday afternoon after having been a little out of touch on Saturday. We might have been out at an Aware, might have been out on North Prospect for Aware at that time.
Yes.
But anyway, I turned it on Sunday to find out that the coup had been overthrown. This has been documented in a wonderful sort of cinema verite documentary called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised."
Yes.
And that really, there happened to be some filmmakers there at the time, not even knowing
Irishmen
who happened to be able to get a lot of this on tape, and it is just a wonderful. If you need to be inspired, then that's a good film. But if you need a larger context and don't want to read about it, then you can watch Oliver Stone's movie, South of the Border, from a couple of years after that, which discusses both Venezuela and the broader history of the relationship of the United States with Latin America. And it's important to see all this in the context of the neoliberalism, which we are always referring to, on this program of the last 40 years, and those countries that rebelled against the dictates of the IMF, structural adjustment, and who saw, while they saw their growth stagnate in the 80s and 90s, have since seen much more rapid growth, namely Argentina, and as well as countries like Venezuela, and Ecuador, and Bolivia, and perhaps Paraguay, and then Brazil in the wake of the aforementioned Lula and his successor. So all this is sort of been personified and symbolized in terms of Chavez's leadership of this rebellion against American influence. But the deep-seated economic rebellion has really been much broader, and certainly the story of Argentina in the early 2000s, their rejection of their IMF debt, their going off the dollar, their willingness to suffer through a year of economic turmoil, and then their quick rebound to well past where they started out, has been a lesson, which, one of those good examples that the United States is afraid might be learned, and in fact is being learned. A little footnote of something interesting I read about Ecuador and their leader Rafael Correa, someone who will not be invited to speak at the graduation ceremony at the University of Illinois, as opposed to the American dream of Shahid Khan, who has made billions. Correa, after getting his economics degree here, his doctorate here, went back and has managed to lead his country. But sort of an interesting comment that I'm only recently aware of the oil wealth in that country, in that very poor country, and its addition, its asset to them, but also interested to read that they're looking for ways, speaking of sustainable, not to be dependent on that oil wealth, looking for ways to not draw that oil out of the ground, because when you draw oil out of the ground, it inevitably despoils the environment for the people living in that region, and creates who rarely benefit from that, unless you're maybe Chavez and Correa, but even beyond that, the environmental degradation that goes along with bringing carbon out of the earth in various ways is something that apparently Correa is very aware of as he plans his economy for a sustainable future. And if you want to see the anti-story to what has gone on in South America, one only needs to look at the influence of the United States in Latin America, in Central America. All of those countries, perhaps with the exception of Costa Rica, Chomsky talks about that exhaustively regarding the 80s and 90s. He also talks exhaustively about Haiti and all of the finagling that went on, all of the fact of Aristide's ascension to power and the coups against him, and the economic policies that punished that very poor country even prior to the earthquake a couple of years ago. So if one wants to see the worst possible case, we all know all about Venezuela now, as I mentioned before. We don't know a whole lot about Haiti. There aren't all these experts about Haiti floating around telling what Haiti, because Haiti's fine. Haiti's impoverished. The rich people are running Haiti. The rich investors benefit from Haiti. We don't need articles in the newspaper and op-ed columns telling Haiti what's best for itself, because we know what's best for them. It's to be miserably poor, and that's the way it should be. Oh, I'm lapsing back into sarcasm, so maybe it's time for me to stop.
Just one more service that I offer, sarcasm.
Thank you, David. You've got something non-sarcastic to say, Ron?
No, that's such a general thing.
Yeah.
That this bias of perception and thought, that it's difficult to deal with. I'll maybe return sometime to the theme of intellectual honesty and bias and all of that, but not today.
Okay, thank you very much. That's the theme of environmental degradation was taken up this week by our mentor, Noam Chomsky, in a piece that you can find on the web and that I recommend highly as an account of the general political issues that we've been talking about here. I'll link to it, by the way, from our Facebook page, too, so that if you want to look for news from Neptune, you can find a reference or a link to this article entitled, "Will Capitalism Destroy Civilization?" This is important. Chomsky has been writing for a while now things for the New York Times syndicate. It's very interesting what the New York Times does with Chomsky's pieces. It peddles them around the world. These pieces turn up in the Times of India and places like this, but the New York Times syndicate doesn't publish them in the United States. In other words, they know they have a valuable commodity, but they, for a variety of reasons, including the intellectual stance, such as it is, of the New York Times, they don't want it to be published very widely in America. So it turns up on odd websites and in the excellent paper, by the way, In These Times, sort of the continuation of the old underground papers from a generation or more ago in Chicago. Will Capitalism Destroy Civilization is the title, and in it Chomsky discusses these issues that David was alluding to regarding the development of Latin America as well, starting with the notion when we talk about capitalism, we're engaging in a vast charade that is being encouraged by our pundits and our intellectual institutions about what capitalism is and how the term should be used. And Chomsky begins with the fairly innocent-sounding observation, there is capitalism and then there is really existing capitalism. The term capitalism is commonly used to refer to the U.S. economic system with substantial state intervention, now that's contrary to the basic notion of capitalism, right? Ranging from subsidies for creative innovation to the too big to fail government insurance policy for banks. The system is highly monopolized, further limiting reliance on the market and increasingly so. In the past 20 years, the share of profits of the 200 largest enterprises has risen sharply, reports scholar Robert W. McChesney in his new book, Digital Disconnect. Bob McChesney is a friend of this ground, and his new book is certainly worth looking at here, but Chomsky is talking about the problem of our discussing capitalism, even American capitalism, with the fact that the language being used to discuss it hides the reality rather than illustrates it. He writes, capitalism is a term now commonly used to describe systems in which there are no capitalists. For example, the worker-owned Mondragon conglomerate in the Basque region of Spain, or the worker-owned enterprises expanding in northern Ohio, often with conservative support. Both are discussed in an important new book by the scholar Gar Alperovitz. It seems to me that what Chomsky is doing here in part is trying to clean up the language, allow us to talk about what actually is going on, as he says, really existing capitalism. And that would be a consummation devoutly to be wished. Actually, to have that discussion would be worthwhile, and it would get us a long way away from the AP account of what the economic issues are.
Our economic system is sustainable only to the extent that it's a mixed economy, and there has to be an admixture of public and collective measures in order to make it tolerable for very long. My short answer to the capitalism question, whether it's compatible with civilization, is in the short run, yes, in the long run, no, but that's, again, a longer story.
This is very much an argument that David Harvey, who's been mentioned previously on this program, has talked about in terms of capitalism. He introduces his argument by saying that the 3% growth in GDP that is expected. He refers to it as compound growth in GDP that has come to be expected in capitalism is in fact not sustainable in terms of the environment or anything else. So he talks about development versus growth, and he in a series of interviews, I'm not sure how long ago, probably within the last year, there's a BBC show called Hard Talk, and you can go on YouTube and watch 3 different YouTubes of about 8 minutes each, which comprise this very rather hostile interview that this young woman allowed him to have on Hard Talk, in which she attempted to defend the viability of capitalism and the benefits of capitalism, in which David Harvey very patiently explained to her what his arguments are, and why in fact that this hasn't been a system which either has benefited everyone or is sustainable in the long run. And this is just these are fundamental arguments they go beyond the kind of Keynesian arguments that we refer to on this program. Although I think if Keynes were alive, in the hypothetical, he probably would have evolved into the kind of position that he may have evolved into the kind of position that people like David Harvey and Noam Chomsky are making about capitalism. What Chomsky has been saying for years is that the meaning of free trade, the meaning of neoliberalism going back to the 1980s and 1990s, was the free flow of not just the free flow of investor capital to other countries to outsource and all that, but the free flow of currency to speculate. So we had a flip in the 1980s and 1990s, whereas the money flying around the world before that had been 90% for actually productive reasons, whereas after that it was more like 95% for speculative reasons. The non-free trade aspects of all these alleged free trade agreements have to do with the enforcement of patent and copyright laws, as well as the limitations on the movement of labor from one country to the other. So these are not free markets. This is not free trade, and the myth. And I'm afraid that in the article I wrote a couple of weeks ago that was in the newspaper, I didn't have enough time to make it clear that I wasn't contrasting government involvement in social programs to the alleged free market. The contrast is this government involvement for social programs versus the takeover of the government by corporate interests, which they certainly have done for the last 120 or so years in this country, ever since the sort of the whole mythology of Theodore Roosevelt and the trust busters and all that stuff.
When the Associated Press came to talk about the Clinton administration's establishment of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in the 1990s, it was all couched in terms of free trade and how the U.S. government was setting up this free trade regime in the Western Hemisphere. Well, it was pointed out at the time that it was not free trade at all. It was not a free trade agreement at all. It was rather an investors' rights agreement. What the agreement, such as even to call it an agreement, was a little hard to do, because it was a matter of something foisted by the United States on the other countries of the Western Hemisphere and rejected by a good number of them. The attempt was to establish, as David was saying, the rights of investors. And we find the American government continuing precisely with this. The Obama administration now is working very hard to establish a NAFTA for the Pacific, the TPP, which is also an investors' rights agreement for the economy of the Pacific. Well, hey, this is where we came in. Wasn't an argument about the Pacific that led to the wars of the American century, the 20th century? Is there a a loop in this reel? I mean, we've seen this before, right? In any case, understanding the economic circumstances against the sorts of things we're told in the news is perhaps the most important thing to do. In the article I was referring to, Chomsky goes on with a reference that we'll have to abandon this a bit with, but he says some might even use the term capitalism to refer to the industrial democracy advocated by John Dewey, America's leading social philosopher in the late 19th and early 20th century. Dewey called for workers to be, quote, masters of their own industrial fate, and for all institutions to be brought under public control, including the means of production, exchange, publicity, transportation, and communication. Short of this, Dewey argued, politics will remain, quote, the shadow cast on society by big business, close quote. The truncated democracy that Dewey condemned has been left in tatters in recent years. Now control of government is narrowly concentrated at the peak of the income scale, while the large majority down below has been virtually disenfranchised. The current political economic system is a form of plutocracy, diverging sharply from democracy, if by that concept we mean political arrangements in which policy is significantly influenced by the public will. There have been serious debates over the years about whether capitalism is compatible with democracy. If we keep to really existing capitalist democracy, RECD for short, says Chomsky, the question is effectively answered. They are radically incompatible. And that's
one of the footnotes to that I came across recently was the notion of fast track, as it was used for the trade agreements back in the 90s or perhaps since.
Yep.
And what Chomsky makes very clear is what fast track means is that these things are going to be done in secret. It's not any of the people's business. It's not any of the rabble's business. These things will be decided by, as Chomsky always refers to, the smart guys. And again, that just it's basically fast track is a way of saying this isn't a democratic process, again, emphasizing the incompatibility between democracy and capitalism of this form.
Exactly. We're coming to the end of the show. You've been watching News from Neptune, and at this last part, we have Coburn's Corner. The last writing from the late journalist Alexander Coburn was a pamphlet called Guillotined, in which Coburn nominated cliches, overused phrases, and tedious words for elimination. We want to carry on his great work by adding our own suspects to this kill list, which, by the way, is a lot less literally lethal than Barack Obama's kill list. You got a nominee for the list, Ron?
Sure. It is the word envy, which is commonly used for those like myself who are concerned about inequality. Some have tried to elaborate this into an entire social theory, saying that those people who object to massive inequality are just consumed with envy. They want to have for themselves all the goodies and gadgets and privileges of the very rich and wealthy and successful. And indeed, some have tried to turn biblical statements about not coveting this and that into a condemnation of envy as well. So it's supposed to be an ugly emotion that few of us have. Apparently, even those like myself who consider the big rich utterly contemptible, but we're supposed to be envious of them at the same time. So don't covet your neighbor's house, or in biblical language, his ass, or whatever.
So you're saying the last commandments are actually a defense of capitalism, actually existing capitalism in the sense that Chomsky's talking about.
Yeah. Well, some have tried to make that out of them.
Yeah. You got a candidate for the corner?
After
David?
coveting somebody's ass, I'm not quite sure where to go with that, but. I just, as I was thinking about it today, I didn't, I assumed that we would have covered all our bases in the wake of Hugo Chavez's death, in terms of populist firebrands and all of the learned language we've already referred to before. So I don't really have anything to add except that it's been a banner week. I mean, if the the bladesman would have, you know, if Coburn were alive, he
Yeah.
would have been busy. He would have been up late,
Boy, would he.
writing an extra. He used to write his column on Fridays. He would have been late into the day collecting all of these words that have been used to describe what's going on in Venezuela and with Hugo Chavez.
Stop the presses. This just in.
Yes, they would have to, light candles in the square around the guillotine in order to get all the work done that was needed.
Yeah.
The argument you raise, Ron, the envy and the fact that political problem is that people are envious of those who've done well in the society and so on. I first encountered that actually not in the U.S. but in Britain over a generation ago, in a lead up to the Thatcher days in Britain, and they're interesting parallels, but also sometimes instructive differences between British and American capitalism, and specifically with the sort of propaganda that covers it. And that envy argument, which works, perhaps even better in a British class system, was quite common. And I actually had never heard it in quite those terms when, as a naive young man, I fetched up on Albion's fatal shore, and but we have heard it again in this country, as you say, as you point out, more recently. I don't know what's happening there. Are we late to the party? We're late to the envy party or something?
Well, there are some right-wing commentators who are saying that people voted for Obama because they thought he was going to give them things, goodies.
They wanted stuff. That's
right.
Not
They want stuff.
Not just commentators, but even candidates.
They're envious of the people who have that stuff.
Right. This was the famous speech of what was his name? That guy who ran as the Republican candidate against Obama in this last election. Yeah. He said, he'll get to 47 people who want to be given stuff. That speech, by the way, I gather I hadn't realized that the source of the videotape of that speech was Jimmy Carter's nephew. Was it? Was a nephew or grandson who had taped that speech and made it available. But here's that argument. Yeah, full blown. I mean, it's quite remarkable that the argument should be as prominent as it is in contemporary American politics. When we've got Nobel Prize winners in economics giving lectures on this campus this week saying that we don't have a debt or deficit problem in this country. This guy's no leftist. We don't have a debt or deficit problem in this country. We have a jobs problem in this country. Mm-hmm. I mean, anyone who has looked at the matter at all without the obscuring glasses of the American press knows that the one thing that was necessary when the Obama administration came into office was jobs, a jobs program. Poor people need money. People who are having their houses foreclosed need money, and they need jobs, and we don't have any jobs. The morning papers are full of pains to, 236,000 jobs were created last month. But once again, if you get behind the cheerleading of the press, we find out that there has been no change in the percentage of the workforce, or the relation of the workforce to the population at all, and that the adjustments of this last month may turn out simply to be seasonal, the result of a fairly warm winter in a lot of places, and the jobs that normally come with the return of good weather in the spring may be, as it were, being anticipated a bit. So the notion that what the press is saying is all this good news about the economy is in fact a cover for the absolutely wretched job the administration has done for the economy, except if we take the economy to mean the profits of rich people, which are doing very nicely. Thank you.
The great economist Dean Baker just sent out something this morning saying that as what you referred to, the labor force participation rate is still 4% below where it was 5 or 6 years ago. Mm-hmm. That amounts to 1% is 3 million people. So we're talking about 12 million people who should have jobs now that don't have jobs, according to the participation rate. You might want to modify it, the expected participation rate, a little bit as the baby boomers get older, but that's a technical point. We don't need to talk about that.
And while we're actually talking about the quite legitimate question of whether this president should be killing Americans or other people around the world, and thank goodness the breakdown of the American party system is actually presenting us, perhaps with a discussion about that, once the facade cracks a little, some little bits of light get through, and that seems to be what's happening this week. But we're not even getting to that on the economy at all, and the people who are suffering most from the things that this administration should be doing and are not, those people continue to suffer. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 10th week of 2013. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky. This has been the International Working Women's Day edition. If our program has interested you, you might want to look for similar programs here on Urbana Public Television, now not only on cable, but streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been David Green and Ron Szoke. This and other editions of this program may be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook, and I'm happy to receive your comments. And I appreciate some we've got recently that have directed our discussion this evening. Our thanks to Urbana Public Television as usual, especially Jake, Jason, and notably Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. And in the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.